Kia koto, and welcome here today to the first of Lincoln University's new Frontline Forum series, which we try to have these as fast-moving conversations about the big issues shaping our land, food, and future in the land-based sector in particular. My name is Grant Edwards. I'm the Vice-Chancellor here at Te Whare Wanaka Aoraki Lincoln University, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session here today. What we're going to address today is the pretty direct question around national food security. And do we need a strategy for this? And what are the perspectives around that? For a country that produces enough food to feed many millions beyond our borders, food security can sometimes feel like a thing that we don't really need to think about. But that assumption is certainly being tested by rising food prices, higher fuel costs, supply chain disruption, and ongoing costs of living pressure, things that we really need to consider. And alongside that, there is a growing concern that some of the food that we produced is never actually eaten, and wasted issues. Taken together, these pressures raise bigger questions, not just about affordability, but about how our food system actually works from end to end. From how our food is produced, through to how it moves through our supply chains, and who can actually access it in the end. Today's session, there are no formal presentations. It's a moderated discussion through a series of questions, and we've brought together a series of perspectives from industry, researchers, students, and food system voices to explore resilience and affordability, access and production across New Zealand food systems. A couple of quick housekeeping points as we go into this. We'll move through a series of moderated questions, which will probably take over the first hour of this session. Then we'll open it up for an audience Q&A session, and you can use the Q&A function to push those questions into to be available. First of all, we'll move to introducing our panelists today for this discussion. And their full bios are available online, but here's a short snapshot of who's here today to contribute to this discussion. Firstly, we have Andrew Clifford from EatNZ. Andrew has led EatNZ for the past 10 years, working across the food system from producers through chefs and communities. She has helped establish initiatives such as the New Zealand Growing Grains Mark in partnership with the Foundation for Arable Research and Food for Good procurement program delivered through Compass Group New Zealand. She is also part of the Vote for Kai movement, calling for food system transformation, and recently published 16 things we could do right now to increase New Zealand's food security. Second person I'd like to introduce today is Dr. Nick Lees. Nick works in agribusiness and strategic management with a focus on agri-food supply chains here at Lincoln University. His research explores how New Zealand can strengthen competitive advantage through higher value production, improved supply chains, coordination, and better alignment with consumer demand. Also, I'd like to welcome Zara Westenheim. Zara is president of the Lincoln University Students Association, where she represents students across university governance and decision-making, advocating for well-being, inclusion, and academic success. Zara brings a lived student perspective on affordability, access, and what food insecurity looks like for young people today. Zara is currently studying at Lincoln University on a Bachelor of Agriculture. Welcome, Zara. Final person I'd like to introduce today is Scott Champion, who is CEO of the Foundation for Arable Research. Scott leads the Foundation for Arable Research, representing New Zealand's arable sector across grain and seed systems. He works closely with growers, researchers, and industry partners to improve productivity, sustainability, and resilience in arable food systems. Welcome here today. I'm going to kick off with some opening questions, which will go to our panel members. And I'll start with you, Angela, to start off. When we talk about food security, what do we actually mean? And in your view, is New Zealand's food truly secure? Welcome, Angela.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Grant. There is an internationally accepted definition of food security, And that's that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food, which is sustainably sourced, which meets their dietary needs. And further, that it should be culturally appropriate and that people should be able to make their own choices or have agency about the food they eat, where it comes from, and how it's produced. But beyond a definition, in 1978, New Zealand signed the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And this is a legally binding international obligation to ensure every person in Aotearoa has physical and economic access to adequate, culturally appropriate food, not as charity, not as welfare, but as a human right. So given that food insecurity remains significant, for example, the New Zealand Food Network's recent hunger monitor found that 1 in 3 or a third of New Zealand's households experienced some form of food insecurity over the last 12 months, and that domestic food policy focuses only on safety and not access, shows that we're not meeting our international legal obligations. So New Zealand isn't even remotely food secure.
Thank you, Angela, for the opening thoughts. Nick, what are your thoughts around food security? And how we
I think I thought it was really good, Angela, that you've defined food security in terms of food security to families in New Zealand. I think often when we initially think about food security, it's kind of thought about as at a national level, and often that's where it is overseas. Countries that are net importers of food, it's about how secure are we as a nation. But I really agree with that. That I think the statistics are that about 20% of families are severely food insecure, which means they're missing meals a week. And so I think it's really important that we focus on that, because I think in terms of a national position, we are very food secure. We're one of the few nations that have a huge food surplus that, we really only consume about 10 or 20% of what we produce. And our main food imports are things like vegetable oils, rice, which are often commodity products that can easily be stored. So, in reality, if you shut down the borders, as we've seen, New Zealand could probably, with all the sheep we've got, we could probably keep eating meat for quite a while with a bit of wine and a few kiwi fruit. So we'd probably be doing all right.
Thank you, Nick. Scott, and then I'll come to you, Zara, your thoughts around this.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Look, I probably don't have too much to add to what Angela and Nick were saying, but I think Nick's point about thinking about security in the context of not just production, but right through to those that consume the product is really important. And having worked through a number of sectors in food and fibre over a period of time, often on the production side, we just think about, do we produce enough? We don't necessarily, and then in many of our industries, we're very export focused. We don't necessarily think about that domestic lens. And I think it's pleasing to see that that's changing. And in a number of fora over the last couple of years, I've sort of seen that discussion and this recognition about domestic food security going up. So I think it's on the agenda. People like Angela have really got it sort of a bit front and center, but often on the production side, it's not necessarily something that we're thinking about, as Nick says, all the way through to access of food to families and things like that. So can't really add too much more than that.
Yeah. Zara, I've got before I go to you, I've got a particular question for you, which is that a University of Auckland study report found that a recent report found that 45% of students surveyed didn't have reliable access to affordable, nutritious foods. Many reported smaller meals, buying cheaper options, or making food last as long as possible. From a student perspective at Lincoln University, what are you actually seeing in terms of food access and affordability right now?
Thanks, Grant. Yeah, I think especially when you take into account Angela's definition that food must be sufficient, safe, and nutritious, I think a lot of the time across the country, you'll see students choosing cheaper options, and often those aren't the most nutritious. You hear about students having noodles every night for a week, and that's not going to give them the nutrients to study, to work, and do everything that they need to do. And I think that extends to Lincoln University. We have our free food events and stuff like that, and they wouldn't be so popular if students had sufficient access to nutritious food. And you see that across the country with the Student Association food banks, the free food events, everything.
Okay, thank you. And it's become much more visible on campus from your perspective in your time here as a student?
I would say so, yes. I think it's definitely more visible at the moment with other costs increasing, such as the fuel crisis and stuff like that. I think it's definitely more visible at the moment.
Okay, Scott, moving to you and thinking from an arable sector point of view, how well is New Zealand positioned for at least that sector to produce enough of the staple food domestically, particularly in grains and associated cropping systems?
Yeah, it's a great question, Grant. I was talking to some of my colleagues yesterday, just thinking about this event today, and we were talking about the fact that during the 80s, we were actually self-sufficient in grains for human consumption. And so, the amount of grain and sort of related products that we produce through the arable sector is enough to, volumetrically, if you like, to feed the nation. But in terms of the economics of production, in fact, a very significant proportion of that goes into feed, so into livestock feed rather than human food. And I was just looking at some data yesterday. If we looked across wheat, barley, and maize grain, out of our total production, about 82% of that, in fact, went to feed rather than to human consumption. And so that's a reflection of the sort of the changing dynamics, growth of the dairy sector over time, and some of those sorts of things. So agronomically and in terms of the land capability we have, we could. And we do produce enough product, but it's about the split between animal consumption and human consumption. And so if we were going to revert back to a sort of a production mix similar to the 80s, then we'd need to change our varieties. But that's sort of the drivers and incentives for that are really economic, rather than being, whether it's agronomically possible or the land can support that. So it's sort of about production choice, some of the underlying economics of our production systems rather than about can our land do it and would it be physically possible in New Zealand?
Okay, Scott, and just picking up on that, when was the major transition that you think happened from being self-sufficient through to this current position? When did that happen? What were probably the key drivers in that?
Yeah, my understanding is it's another one of those artifacts of all of the sort of reforms during the 80s. So, when we saw very significant changes in sheep numbers, for example, the famous drop from the 75 million head peak to down in the sort of mid to low 20s where we are now. So that window of change through the 80s and the 90s, the removal of some of those incentive systems that went across a number of the sectors sort of precipitated that change. And I guess the other point, Grant, is the sector's really dynamic. So no two arable farms are the same, and the mix on any individual farm changes year to year based on economics and split between profitability and the livestock component and the arable component as well. So yeah, it's started then through the sector reforms and continues to shift around a bit each year depending on what's happening.
Okay, thank you. Nick, a question for you, please. And you do a lot of work in supply chains, both national and global supply chains, and I guess that those overall supply chains are an important part of our food security. Where are we most vulnerable at this point in time, from your perspective, in our supply chains, from a food security point of view?
Yeah, great question. I just wanted to jump in and comment on something that you said, Scott, which I think is sometimes overlooked in terms of food resilience. So, and the importance of international supply chains in actually providing that resilience. To give an example, if we did produce all our cereal crops that we needed to supply New Zealand, one of the issues is that most of that would be in Canterbury. So, what we've seen with more severe climate events is that if we had a major climate event in Canterbury at the time, then that actually decreases our food resilience. So having connections to international supply chains that are much more regionally distributed, can actually increase food resilience. It may decrease food self-sufficiency, but I think it's important to see that difference. As far as the vulnerabilities, I guess, what we've seen in New Zealand is that we're incredibly efficient at producing food, certainly animal products and some others of that. But that doesn't mean that our food system or our supply chains are actually resilient. And I think the other thing to pick up on is around the not necessarily equitable as well. And we've seen, so some of those vulnerabilities are loss of processing capacity. And I think the other issue is the real high cost of food and the impact that that's having on families and where people are getting less nutritious food. And I think a good example of that is that there's been surveys that have been done that, and generally in New Zealand, that we get enough energy from our food, enough calories, but a lot of what we consume is not very nutritious. So I've seen some studies or heard of some studies in retirement villages where a lot of the people there, they may be getting enough calories, but they're not getting enough nutrients. And part of that is that older people don't eat as much. And then because of cost pressures, they're given a lot of carbohydrate and not necessarily protein or nutritious food. So I really think probably a real key vulnerability is the cost of food at the moment and the impact that that's having on consumption of nutritious food.
Okay, thank you, Nick. You mentioned some thoughts there around cost, and Angela, you've spoken a lot about the financialization of food in the commentary that you've brought forward. Can you unpack what that means and what it's doing to affordability and access? And I did note that someone just dropped a post question in there, which was around affordability and access are different things. And so you might want to unpack that as part of this, please.
Yeah, sure. Financialization of food basically acknowledges that at every step in our supply chain, the key purpose of our food system has become to maximize profits for shareholders, as an example. So the key purpose of our food system is no longer to feed us. Extraordinary profits in production and manufacturing right through to supermarkets. It's important to note that livelihoods and profits are important, and I want to counter the inevitable rebuttal that increased profits is a rising tide that lifts all boats. I think we're all probably aware that trickle-down economic theory does not hold water, and if we needed proof of this, we could see it from our current food insecurity levels. Basically, we have low wages and high food costs. And I would argue that export-focused agriculture is only profitable because the true costs are externalised. And some of the very workers that produce our export food, including seasonal workers, horticultural freezing workers, are amongst our most food insecure. And in fact, if you look at the New Zealand Food Network's report, 67% of food insecure households cite low-paying jobs as a driver of food insecurity. So our economic system relies on cheap food and low wages, and we've broken that social contract. And I wanted to give you an example of how financialisation shows up in my community at the moment. The wine industry is in the doldrums, and it's the global companies and the superannuation funds who own vineyards who are the first to pull up vines and to exit when the numbers don't stack up. They leave behind hundreds of unemployed people with no obligation to support them or retrain them, and a community that needs to support them. So that's my example of financialisation of our food system.
Okay. Nick and perhaps Scott, do you see that emerging anywhere else and across the sectors and this financialisation of food as expressed there by Angela?
Nick, do you want to have the first crack at that?
I was just going to ask you the same thing. Yeah, I think that's a real complex answer. And I think one of the issues with that, and I guess kind of jumping ahead a bit to looking at, well, you know, what do we actually need to do in practical ways? I think one of the things that is important is actually to map our food system. I don't think we understand that well in terms of where our food is produced and where that goes. And the knowledge of that is quite distributed. So I don't think anybody has a real picture of the whole food system and how it's working. I guess you talked about high margins. I think if you talk to people who are farmers, producers, that there aren't high margins, that in many cases they're struggling, and that's where also issues around food waste comes in, because they effectively can't affordably produce and market that produce, because it's going to cost them more to harvest it than it is that they will get in returns. I think I agree with you that there are power issues in that supply chain, and that's where you do get financialisation or issues where people are taking profits. I also agree with you that the food access issue is a financial one, and I think that is where we need to address it in terms of if we're looking at an equitable food system where there's lack of food security. A key way we need to look at that is the income that both working families and families that are on benefits who just can't afford the food in the supermarket at the moment.
Scott, please.
Oh, Grant, I was just going to pick up on Nick's comment. You know, I think if you look across the sectors, the sort of ownership structures at the production end differ quite significantly. And so, but there's no doubt that almost whichever sector you look at in terms of producing food and whatever the nature of the product is in New Zealand, that the acquisition of scale over time has been a sort of a feature. We've got, you know, if we go back to the 80s that we were talking about 10 minutes or so ago, we have significantly larger production units on average now and a smaller number of them. So that acquisition of scale, whether it's a family farming unit or through the sort of corporate structures that Angela was referencing, is absolutely a feature. But for many producers, you know, margins are still pretty thin. I work in a sector that is pretty challenging at the moment. And you only had to go back probably 3 seasons, even in sheep and beef, a sector that's doing very strongly at the moment, where they're in a similar situation. So those ups and downs at the production end from a producer view are pretty challenging.
Yeah, thank you. We come back to a couple of these things, but I want to bring Zara in here and talk a little bit more about students and what students experience. Is it just price, or is it access and availability of that food as well?
Say price is definitely sort of the leading factor, but it brings in all sorts of other issues, such as, like I said earlier, the nutritional value of the food that is available and accessible. And I think there is a large inequity of what food is accessible price-wise. Two different to different parts of the country and to different people. I think students can be sort of an indicator of broader issues in that sense as well. And in something like a fuel crisis, they can, if students are struggling to pay for food and having to choose between stuff like rent and course materials and transport to uni and work and food, when food is the most flexible expense out of those, it's often the first to be sort of cut down on. And I'd say that that's a good indicator of larger issues to come across the country.
Thank you, Zara. I'm going to just come back to you, Scott, and then to Nick, and talk about sort of opportunities to increase, I guess, domestic food supply and remove food security. And take the context of the arable sector, Scott, what would need to change to actually make some improvements in that from your point of view? Is it incentives, infrastructure, policy? What are the things there that really inform that from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of a number of those things that you just mentioned there, Grant. You know, we in terms of our arable production systems in New Zealand, they inherently have a lack of scale for a commodity product produced globally. You know, we're quite small scale producers, highly productive on a per unit land area basis. But small in terms of the sort of aggregate scale, say compared to Australia or Canada or the US or you know, those big sort of grain producers. The nature of our systems also is that we're competing for, you know, what our jargon, our descriptor is Class 1 land. So typically this is the same land that's being used for dairy production or to finish lambs, you know, and in fact we might see the integration of those in our arable systems as well. So I think the stat is about 92% of arable farmers have some form of livestock production in their systems. So they're quite unusual mixed systems that aren't typically seen in arable production elsewhere around the world. And then we import expensive stuff to put into those systems. So I'm thinking of things like fertilizer, machinery particularly is one that we've seen massive price inflation probably over the last 5 or 6 years. And then there are issues around sort of limited storage and some logistics challenges. And the cost of transport, for example, of getting grain from the South Island to the North Island across Cook Strait is incredibly expensive and adds significantly to the costs of finished product. So there's a whole mix of things you know, that are probably in play there. And it is about thinking about what you know, are there policy settings there that might, you know, that might make a difference over time. And I think often we seem to have a discussion in New Zealand that we want to be completely export focused, or we need to think about domestic. And I think we've got to try and have conversations that both of those things can be true. And you know, how do we enable one from that domestic food security perspective, you know, or try to ease transport costs and the costs of just getting stuff around the place, while also thinking about how do we grow the export economy. And I sense that that's starting to occur, but it feels as though that's quite a new thing, having that conversation. So I think that's quite encouraging, and we want to see the momentum continue on that.
Thank you, Scott. Some interesting commentary there. And Nick, we've talked a bit about the cost of food, but you mentioned on a number of occasions that there's other costs in there. There's environmental impact, water quality, and biodiversity. And you could argue that food is arguably much more expensive when you put those in those contexts in than what we actually see at the checkout at this point in time.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That particularly with our, I guess, export orientation, effectively we're shipping food off to other countries, but we're bearing the cost on the environment and the emissions of that. I mean, the converse is when we import a car from China, we get the car, but their coal-powered fire station electricity network and things like that, is that they deal with those carbon emissions. So, you know, there is a big issue around that. You know, I think key thing about food is that it touches everybody every day. And I think there is the whole environmental cost of food. I think the other aspect of food that we often don't think about is the health cost of food. And you know, that is getting huge in terms of just the effect on human health and well-being. I think, you know, New Zealand is very slow to introduce regulations that can have a significant impact. Take, for example, France has a law around food waste, where it's actually illegal for supermarkets to dispose of food that is still edible. I think on the health side of it, there's the sugar tax, which has been shown worldwide to have a major impact on things like obesity and diet. We seem to have a very strong lobby, I guess it is, and I guess also there seems to be quite a reluctance in terms of actually putting in legislation that even though it's well researched and that there's good documentation, there's that feeling that the government shouldn't be interfering with what we're doing. So that would be one of the key things I would say.
Thank you, Nick. And just while we have a just a little pause here, I'll just ask you if you do have any Q&A questions, please, from the audience. And I see there's about 100 people online for this. Just post them into Q&A function, and we can get those coming forth now as we near the end of the moderated discussion at the start there. So if you could put your Q&A questions into there, that would be great. And that's in the Q&A function that's available. Angela, and I think moving on from what Nick said there about, I think he was suggesting around government policy and regulation and strengthening the food system, and he alluded to some examples in France around wastage of food in particular. What do you think the role of government should actually play? What role should they actually play in strengthening the food system? Are we seeing enough leadership in this space at this point in time? I'm sure you have a view on that.
Grant, this is a dream question. Thank you so much. Where do I start? I honestly can't think of a government agency or ministry that doesn't touch food in Aotearoa, and that's part of the problem, I think, is what's happened is because no one's taking the lead, everyone gets a chance to say it's not our job. I think there is some amazing work that's happening in government already, and I really want to acknowledge that. I'll do a quick round the room to MPI. Policy settings to ensure local food producers and small to medium food producers thrive. I want to actually acknowledge the awesome work that MPI has been doing in this space in response to the Food Act amendments. I know that there's some really cool work that they've been doing, and I just encourage them to continue that, to try and right the balance to ensure that there's a level playing field and there's an opportunity for those small to medium food producers. I think there's a genuine opportunity. You know, we've just come up with a national fuel strategy, which I find astonishing that we can come up with a national fuel strategy pretty much overnight, but we still don't have a national food strategy. And I think part of that is that we need to shift the boundaries of national food security beyond social programs. So as an example, MSD has the only food security fund I can find in the entire country. It's a $1 million food community initiative fund. And again, I want to acknowledge the amazing work that MSD has done in terms of holding on to this fund, particularly over the last few years. But the problem is that there's an opportunity to extend that fund from a very small fund to something that could be cross-ministry. and that money is distributed to community organisations already doing the mahi. So there is extraordinary work that's been done at grassroots level across the country. And so enabling, supporting and resourcing those organisations to continue to do the work, much of which is volunteered and under-resourced, and people just do it because they're trying to keep things going. That's a really important place the government could step in. I'd also like the government to deploy local government in this area. So to instruct that food be considered critical infrastructure alongside things like social housing, waste systems, water, set local food business targets, work with EDAs or economic development agencies in the space to ensure that food security is part of their programs. I think local government play a key role in decentralising and handing food security back to communities. I'd like to see the government increase their procurement rules. At the moment, local procurement rules, they sit around 10%, 25% is sort of a global, you're doing the right thing, so they could do that. We could include food transport and distribution in national critical infrastructure. We're talking about national critical infrastructure at the moment. Look at something like a freight equalisation scheme. So something that Scott mentioned is how incredibly expensive it is to move food from the North Island to the South Island or backwards. And our trading partners such as Australia have something called a freight equalisation scheme. That means that it sees State Highway 1 extended across the Cook Strait, and that there, at the moment there's a 54% fuel surcharge to move food across that piece of water. So reconsidering how we see that piece of water, I think, would be absolutely a key role that government could play. There is health. Let's talk about health. We could introduce green prescriptions. We could limit food marketing to children. And, speaking to what Nick was talking about creating safe food environments and ensuring that what our people can see and have access to is food that is nutritious and supports them. We could set geographic targets for food access and availability to avoid food swamps and deserts. Pretty much give me a food government ministry and I can give them a food job. MB, you have New Zealand Tourism's just stepped into food tourism. How about supporting New Zealand Farmers Market Association? Never received a single cent of money from the government. This is a key opportunity to support their National Farmers Market Week, which happens in autumn. You could use that as a New Zealand tourism play, a food tourism play, or it could be an economic development play. But most importantly, and here's the point I want to get to, we could have a plan. Call me crazy. A plan for our food system, a national food strategy, a food security strategy, a set of values, a vision, a stated mission beyond export targets, a North Star or a Matariki cluster. Honestly, I'm at the point where I'm ambivalent about what it's called, but let's have a plan.
Thank you, Angela. Some really passionate thoughts around food security going into that have come through. I'll just the other panel members will probably have an opportunity to reflect on some of those things, and I'll just open it up there, particularly around the what government should actually do, but also there is an increasingly thought in there what local government might do as opposed to central government in this and what role they may play. So do you have any thoughts around that from the panel at this point in time?
I just wanted to jump in with one thing, which I guess we've discussed a lot of the failures of the food system. I think we should also acknowledge that actually the food system to some degree actually works incredibly well. It was COVID when we went in and suddenly people discovered that food didn't just magically turn up in supermarkets. there are issues around the cost of food, there are issues around accessibility of food, but the food system actually works pretty well by providing food for our people in Aotearoa on a daily basis. So I think it's just important to kind of have that in the background, and that kind of helps to see that actually the things we need to do to ensure food security in terms of the overall food system aren't major issues that need to be fixed. They're really important issues, but they can be significantly changed because we do have this food system that does actually function in terms of providing daily food. Now, as we say, we've got issues around access, we've got issues around health, we've got issues around the viability of farmers and producers, we've got issues around food waste, and I think those can be tackled, particularly when we look at it in the big picture, that what we're really trying to deal with is failures in the food system. And so I think that's just in this conversation a thing that we just kind of need to keep in the background.
Thank you. Scott, anything, or Zara, anything from you on that?
I'd probably just pick up briefly on a point that Angela made about freight equalisation. This is one that's fairly dear to my heart. I lived in Tasmania for a number of years, and between the island state and the mainland, there's a freight equalisation scheme, which, as Angela said, basically treats the cost of the notion is that the cost of crossing that stretch of water should be no more than if it was on the land, effectively. So it's treated as part of the national highway system. I think it's a really interesting idea, and I know how important at the production end that was for enabling the catalyst of a number of new crops for both export markets and domestic consumption in Australia on the mainland. So, somehow addressing, whatever the mechanism might be, some of the impediments that getting across Cook Strait provides, I think is a really interesting and valuable idea.
Thank you. We're moving to the end of sort of the moderated questions, so please continue to, if you want to put out some questions in the Q&A that we can pick up soon. I've got this question, which is around practical steps to improve food security. And I'll come to Zara first of all, and around the panel. And so, what is the one or two practical steps that we should really take immediately to improve food security, given the nature of this discussion that we've been through today? So, Zara, first to you.
Thank you, Grant. I think something that I think needs to happen before we start taking all of these specific steps is to address how disjointed the country is in terms of understanding different people's experiences in terms of their access to food, and the different kinds of food that we have access to across the country. I think when it comes to students, I'll always circle back to the students because that's my area of expertise, is student life and student poverty has this odd way in society of being romanticized. And it's sort of like, oh, well, they're living in a leaky, moldy flat. They're living off noodles every day. How funny. And that's just student life. But I think that needs to be addressed. And, it comes to, families as well that are living in poverty. And that's not my area of expertise. But I think people don't know the extent to how much people are experiencing food insecurity, because you don't notice it until it's at a point of crisis. Students will go on with their day, they'll go to work, they'll go to their classes, they'll socialize with their friends in the evenings, and you don't know that they are in a state of food insecurity until they have nothing left. And I think it's important to address that and know exactly what's going on. I think any steps we take need to follow more knowledge in terms of what people are experiencing.
Thank you, Zara. Scott, your one or two practical things?
I actually wanted to pick up on something that Nick said earlier, just a reflection on if you centralise production, given likely, so I'm thinking at production end here, Grant, if you centralise production, for example, of all arable crops in Canterbury, you expose yourself to climate risk, even more. That's likely to become much more significant in the future, and we've seen that across the last couple of seasons with very difficult harvests. So, a practical thing is for those things that are important to achieve the objectives we want, how do we create distribution? And to the other point that we talked about earlier on is how do we think about that sort of last mile element as well? And I think they're often forgotten. And so this sounds a bit fluffy, but almost a practical step is make this conversation a thing, make the conversation visible. And I think that has been a problem. I would, put myself in that category over my working life. I probably haven't thought about that enough. And I'm really pleased to see that it's becoming a much more visible conversation. I think that makes a difference. Whatever form that thinking or that plan or that strategy takes, giving it visibility and, building good understanding so that people act is really key.
Thank you, Nick, and then I'll come to Angela around these. The one practical thing that you'd look at, and particularly in the next 12 months.
Yeah, I mean, I like what Scott said in terms of, I think a really important thing is to continue this conversation. I think the other thing, and that I would kind of really push, is that I think there is a real need to understand our domestic food system. I think we really understand, and at Lincoln, we do a lot of work on our export supply chains, and I think we have a pretty good understanding about how that works. But to be honest, I don't know a lot about the integrated aspect of the New Zealand food system, and we tend to look at it in bits in isolation. So we look at the supermarket duopoly. We can see food banks and the rising demand for families for meeting food needs. We've got a whole lot of these things, and I think before we can actually address some of these problems, we actually need to know what's there, how it's functioning at the moment, because then that gives you the opportunity to see where you can make a difference. And ultimately in these system failure type things, it's multi levers that you've got to push to actually make that change. So it's government policy, it's competition, it's dealing with low incomes and access to food. It's around dealing with the health impacts of food in terms of obesity and other chronic diseases like that. So yeah, for me, just in summary, it would be let's kind of raise this conversation to a much more of a national level, and then that there's a need to actually put in some research and actually understand how the food system is operating on a kind of a whole system perspective.
Thank you. And Angela, your thoughts? I'm sure you have many, but just perhaps the couple that are really on top of mind with you.
Yeah, I think it's important to respond to the other speakers here and to say, Nick, there is a huge amount of mapping that has been done in the New Zealand domestic food system. It often sits at regional levels. If I look at the likes of Weil in Wanaka or even the Buller district, lots of food shed mapping around the Wairarapa as well. So there is work that's being done, and my fear is that we tend to spend all of our resource and money we have mapping what currently exists, which is really no more than a snapshot. And the outcome I've seen from that mapping shows what we intuitively know, that the majority of our food production systems are designed to export our food and not to feed us. So I do think that our science community and our research community have an important role to play here, but I just implore you not to spend all your money mapping the system. And the other thing I really wanted to say to Sarah is that And congratulations to Lincoln University for ensuring that we centre the lived experience of people who are experiencing food insecurity in this conversation. It's very easy to top down it. And I think that it's super important to keep asking the question around who's in this conversation, who's around this, who's around the table when we have these conversations. And wonderfully, I have a solution to your call, Scott, for a continuation of the conversation, which is that we currently have a collective called Vote for Kai. And given it is a national year for a national election, and this is a collective that sits across the food system calling for all political parties who want to form the next government to make a genuine commitment to a food system that works for everyone. The organisations currently involved include Kore Hia Kai, Salvation Army, Health Coalition Aotearoa Food Rescue Alliance, Vets for Animal Welfare, and we're calling for other organisations to join our call as well. You can sign an open letter, just go to voteforkai.nz. And if we're talking about the absolutely immediate moment, this Sunday, Eat New Zealand has an activation called The Shortest Meal, which encourages all New Zealanders for just one meal or just one ingredient to choose New Zealand grown food. And it speaks to the power we have as consumers or as eaters and our ability to exercise some of our food citizenship and make a decision that impacts us all and creates better outcomes. So I'd encourage everybody to have a shortest meal on Sunday, on the shortest day of the year, which is also World Localisation Day.
Thank you, Angela. We've come to the end of the moderated questions that we have, and there are some questions that have come in the Q&A that we'll look at now. And they're picking up on some of the points that we have looked through. But there's one thread in here which it speaks to around I guess the broader cultural shift from taking a national to a local level of around food security, and what might be done at a more local level is the question, and to improve food security, access, availability of food. And you can think of there's a couple of questions in here which allude to what local food networks and how important they are, in addition to the total sort of to the national food network that is available also. So just any thoughts around that as what the relative roles that the local food network can actually play in this, in food security? Thanks. May come to you first, Angela. To say that these networks are extraordinary and they exist everywhere from Te Tai Tokerau down to Rakiura, Stewart Island. You know, I think the opportunity is to understand what your community's response to food security is in the first instance, and also for the government to understand the work that's already being done, rather than for us to have to spend a huge amount of money reinventing the wheel. And I think it's super important to remember our obligations under Te Tiriti in this situation as well, and to allow iwi and hapu and whānau to exercise their food sovereignty and their ability to have food ways that ensure they can feed themselves and their communities. So yeah, that would be my response to that distribution or decentralisation of food security in Aotearoa. Thoughts from other panel members around that local network in particular?
Yeah, I think those local networks are pretty important. I think, you know, we certainly see that in terms of the food rescue organisations, that there's a whole network out there from the food banks through to organisations that collect food from supermarkets, through to the Food Waste Network, which sources food from large manufacturers. And you know, I think I agree with Angela. There is actually a lot going on a local level, and that those things are really significant and really important. But a lot of them receive very little government funding. But all those organisations, they still require logistics, they still require chillers, they still require people who sort through the food that comes in, and so those are kind of like hidden distribution networks that, to be honest, I didn't know a lot about. I have actually started volunteering at one, and that's given me an insight into actually how incredibly complex that system is, that can take food that is surplus and finally deliver it to families who need it.
Thank you, Nick. There's a question coming here, which is around subsidies. And I might pass this one to Scott and Nick to address, and it says, what is the role of subsidies? And it's in the context of New Zealand removed a lot of subsidies in the 1980s, as we've already heard about, and the economic, basically to drive the economics of export production. And is there a place for subsidies moving ahead? Is probably the question. To Scott or Nick in the first instance, and then I'll come to Angela around you.
Well, it's an interesting factor that, I mean, probably if we were living in Europe, we'd probably have quite a different answer to this. And I think part of that is that if we were living in a relatively self area of food where most of our food transactions are happening domestically. In Europe, export market means that you are sending food from the Netherlands to Germany. So I think subsidies can work in that level. I think, and Scott might be able to confirm this, but like most farmers, I understand, in New Zealand do not want their food to be subsidised by the government. And the major reason for that, one, that we're very dependent on export markets, so we have to be very efficient. But also it actually adds another layer of risk to farming. So farmers are used to dealing with climate risk, they're used to dealing with exchange rate, they're used to dealing with markets. Once you introduce subsidies, you introduce a government a regulation risk as well, because you might get given those subsidies, you can also have them taken away. So, you have to then develop this system of lobbying the government, and there's always that extra risk. So I think most New Zealand farmers would say no to subsidies. And also subsidies have generally been shown to one, benefit large producers, and also that subsidy doesn't necessarily reach the consumer, that often it gets absorbed in the supply chain before that. So I guess I suggest my summary is I don't think subsidies are a solution.
Yeah, Grant, I'm with Nick. Look, I need to acknowledge my biases. I've worked in export sectors probably all of my career, so I have a particular mindset that I bring to the conversation. But I think the observation, and from talking to producers in Europe and North America, where elements of subsidisation exist in different forms, there is always the risk that if you apply them at the production end, you farm for the subsidy, not the food outcome that you're actually wanting and needing. And so I think, to Nick's point, that can become a real risk. So a personal view would be that I don't think I support them at the production end. And one of the strengths of New Zealand production post-80s has been land use flexibility, and both within and between enterprises. So I think maintaining that is critical. We don't know what will come in the future in terms of climate vulnerability or changing markets or whatever it might be. But I think, to Angela's point, many of those programs that support addressing where real need sits are not well supported by central government. And so if that is the most effective way to address need, and it's actually not about incentivization of production, then I suspect that's where the focus might be if we're thinking about more more public funding, public support. So yeah, sorry, that's probably a roundabout way of answering it, but I would be worried about subsidisation of production not actually addressing the issue.
Okay. And
I
Angela?
think. Oh, sorry. You go, Angela.
Sorry.
No, that's okay, Nick. You finish.
Oh, well, I was just going to jump in and say, because I spent a bit of time in Ireland looking at their beef industry. And one of the big problems with subsidisation is that you get less efficiency. So for the average Irish beef producer, they might have 20 or 30 cows. But actually, even with their subsidies, they still weren't viable. And so I think that's the big danger, that you distort the market figures and that you tend not to build in those efficiencies. And ultimately, the subsidies just get built into your system, which means that you don't need to introduce more efficiencies to the system. So in the long run, it doesn't actually make the food any more cheaper. It just means that producers are generally not producing as efficiently as they might without those subsidies.
Thank you. Angela, did you have a commentary there?
Yeah, I just would like to acknowledge the lived experience of both Nick and Scott in this space and support their conversations around subsidies. They definitely know them from an agricultural perspective much more than I do. I think we have to remember that we are competing against countries who do have subsidised agriculture. And so the problem is that New Zealand finds it very difficult, particularly when we sit at the commodity end of the market, to compete when we don't have subsidies. But I agree with what Scott said. I don't think the focus is necessarily on putting subsidies at the production end, but it is ensuring that we have the capacity to feed ourselves so that we have a level playing field to ensure that food costs aren't prohibitive to be able to feed our own people. So yeah, I think those arguments are sound.
Okay, thank you. One question that's come up in the Q&A is around the intersection with food safety. And obviously there are two important approaches to this. Is the one that's we need access to food, but it's also going to be safe. And where does that fit in this overall conversation around food security? Do any of the panel members have any thoughts around that and that balance between food security and food safety, or is food safety simply a part of ensuring that we have a secure food system?
Yeah, I would say that we absolutely need safe food. I think part of the problem is that our food safety has really been built around international food systems. So the fact that our food safety settings are primed for the fact that we're exporting our food. So we just need to ensure that when we talk about food safety, the policy and legislation settings are appropriate for domestic food production as well, and that those settings aren't precluding small to medium food producers from both existing and thriving. I know that there is work being done in that space, and it is an interesting conversation, particularly because we have a cross-Tasman relationship through FSANZ. And I think it's important that New Zealand continues to have food safety settings that are appropriate for us as a country and reflect who we want to be and what we want to have. And I think a really good example of that is the fact that we are one of the world's great dairy exporters, yet we have very, very few small cheesemakers in New Zealand. And I think anybody that was coming from overseas to New Zealand would expect a proliferation of small cheesemakers in this country, given how many cows we have. And yet that's not the case. So looking at why that is and understanding that food safety and keeping people safe when they eat food is paramount, but also what can we do in terms of these settings to ensure that there's a proliferation of small to medium food producers in this country.
Thank you. Your thoughts from panel members around that? Okay.
Yeah, probably just cycling back a little bit to the subsidy side of things. I think there are some important things at the consumption level, and I, obviously without getting too political, I think things like having a living wage, and also things like pay equity. So I think there are some issues around just the basic income of the less well-off New Zealanders, and I think that's a structural issue that we also need to think about. New Zealand in terms of wealth has become more divided. I think the recent information was that the top 10% of income earners own 50% of the wealth in New Zealand, and the lower 50% represent only about 6.5% of the wealth in New Zealand. So we have a huge issue in terms of distribution of wealth in New Zealand. And I think that in addressing this issue, it's really about if we can lift the incomes of those very or the large number of people that are struggling on a daily basis. I think that's a real issue where we can actually address some of these things, where we, particularly the living wage, looking at, well, actually what do we want New Zealanders to be able to earn and be able to afford? Are we as a country going to accept that there's going to be a large number of people who don't have the income to be able to buy the food they need for their families, to be able to buy the petrol to put in their car to get to the supermarket? There's a whole lot of issues like that which I think we also need to think about, and those are things that as a government or working with government are some things that we need to really think about.
Okay. Get a question here, which I think speaks to access to the domestic market, and it's come through from the chair of the Canterbury West Coast Deer Farmers. And it speaks to, we often talk about food security as the end outcome and help people access food. But for producers like deer farmers, dry stock farmers, the real barrier is access to a domestic pathway and viability of the domestic pathway. When a lot of the produce is actually sent overseas. And given that we're pushed towards dairying and a lack of domestic supply pathway, have we got value chains here in New Zealand that enable our range of production systems of producing food to really access a New Zealand market? And I'll probably perhaps direct that to Scott and Nick for a view around that and around those. Do we have the access, the supply chains correct for the domestic market as opposed to the international market? Thoughts around that?
I might jump in just through a grains perspective and need to acknowledge some work that we've been doing with Angela and her organisation around a New Zealand Growing Grains initiative. I think there is no lack of entrepreneurial spirit, Grant, and I'm thinking about a piece of work I did in a previous life in the arable sector, thinking about the ability of farmers to integrate up the value chain and what were some of the challenges around that. And it was interesting when you talk to farmers, it wasn't about agronomics or the ability to produce the products. It was about actually, how do I build the business? How do I define the business proposition? How do I identify those that might be able to help me process product and turn it into something that, is consumer ready or, goes to the next user? And so I think those are there, but often they're quite constrained. When you sit in one part of the value chain, it's difficult to work out who you connect with. And there are networks there, but it's even knowing that those networks are there. And so who are the translators and connectors that enable the different parts of, any sort of value chain from producer to consumer to connect up? And, for many, when they're focused on one element of that production enterprise, they just don't have those connections across the farm gate or across from, one stage of transformation into another. And so I think almost as we've become more specialised and focused in different slices of transformation over time, we've lost some of that connectivity with those that use the product. So, whether that's between the farmer and the flour miller, or whether that's between the flour miller and the baker, or whatever it might be. So giving visibility and creating the opportunity for connections so that people can explore those ideas and take their product forward, and not just necessarily supply into an export-focused supply chain, I think is one of the things that we often think's easy, but I'm not sure it is all that easy. And I'm thinking about some of the, Angela will be able to talk to this better than me, but thinking about some of the winners at the recent New Zealand Food Producer Awards, who are integrating those supply chains and creating fabulous products, at the end, and giving recognition to the New Zealand sourcing of the ingredients. So those little examples are there, but we probably don't have enough of them, and we probably miss opportunities for those who'd like to build skills and capability to do more of that, just because they don't know where to connect and where to acquire those skills and capabilities as well. Because they're focused and have built skills in one particular element.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one of the big issues with the domestic supply chain is that it's dominated by the two large supermarkets, and that can make it very difficult for smaller producers to be able to get in there. But also to be able to stay in there, so be able to actually have enough volume or scale to be able to compete in that. So I think that's a big issue in terms of the domestic supply chain, that there is this large duopoly that pretty much controls it. I think probably a bit of a shout out to New World, which tend to be more willing to take on local producers and smaller scale producers, because they're pretty much individually owned, so they have a bit more of a local focus. So I think in terms of addressing the domestic supply chain, I think understanding the dominance of those supermarkets and how, for smaller producers, how they can actually access consumers, because pretty much often they're just left to the farmers markets, and therefore it's really difficult to be able to scale and then be able to compete in the supermarkets with much larger volume stuff. I think Angela's comment, I think, I'm actually constantly amazed at the number of different food producers that there are in New Zealand. Lots that you kind of never heard of. I often look at the back of a packet and think, I haven't heard of them before, and then look them up, and there's some family that's been, producing this for, a long time. So I think, understanding the barriers for those smaller producers, understanding how they can increase scale and have better access to consumers, so that they don't just stay as small niche producers that, because of difficulty at scale, they could really only access people who can actually afford to pay more for product than what they might get from the supermarket.
Thank you. Just we're coming near the end of this, and there's a couple more questions, but I've got just one for Zara. And Zara, just can you give us a couple of examples of what the Lincoln University Student Association is doing to help with food security at this point in time, particularly a reflection of what's happening with rising costs of food and fuel prices? Yeah.
Thank you. I love to talk about what LUSA does.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have, for a long time, we've had our sort of general free food events, but those have increased a lot recently due to a lot of sort of community groups and organizations that are helping us with stuff like that. So one of our clubs that sits under LUSA, the Lincoln Ecological and Sustainability Society, has been harvesting fresh fruit and vegetables from the BHU here at Lincoln University and bringing that out to students to support them. And it's free. They can grab whatever fresh fruit they want. And I think that's a real game changer, that we're able to provide fresh fruit, something with actual, nutritional value to students to keep them going through their studies. And we've had that from a few different community organizations, some businesses as well, that will bring out food that either just for students to try or to support students through their studies. So we've had hot food, we've had bread, we've had noodles again. And so it's a really cool thing to see the community getting involved in what LUSA does. And most recently in semester 1 this year, we had a giveaway of meal kits from New World. So we partnered with New World Lincoln, and they gave us a bit of a discount on, I think it was 400, don't quote me on that, meal kits. And students were able to sign up, pick them up in the evenings. And this was a really good initiative, because it's not just handing them pizza or nachos or a piece of fruit. It's something that they can take home and cook. They learn a new recipe. They cook and eat with their flatmates. So it provides a lot more than just food in their mouths. It provides, social connection, learning, and all sorts of other things as well. And I think that's something we're really trying to move more towards, is food that provides more than just food.
Thank you, Zara, for that. I've just got one last question around before we wrap up, which is around infrastructure to support the food system. And we've seen perhaps recent commentary around closure of various plants and associated with food production, and particularly the horticultural sector. Is there anything missing in our food infrastructure that we have at this point in time? Any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I think the degradation of the infrastructure of the middle, so the manufacturing part, is a reflection of our food system. And so I don't think you can take infrastructure separately without understanding what's influencing it. And just to circle back to supermarkets, what we do in terms of our language, in terms of our narratives and our stories, is we tend to centre our food system on supermarkets. And it's a very easy thing to do because of the situation we find ourselves in. And it's where most New Zealanders find their food. There is an opportunity to change the narrative and to stop centering our food system on supermarkets. And that's not just in terms of where we find our food, but it's in terms of some of the policy settings. And just to give you a couple of examples, when we have something like a pandemic, we close down all avenues of food except for our supermarkets. When we have a something like a Cyclone Gabriel, and there's a list of organisations that are allowed to cross a bridge, for example, supermarkets are on the list, but local food providers aren't. When we have a national fuel strategy and there's diesel reserves, it's supermarkets on the diesel reserve list and not local food distribution organisations. So there's lots of ways we can change our narrative and change our language so that when we talk about food provision, it's not just about supermarkets. And in fact, in the New Zealand grocery report just released, for the very first time, we saw a very small increase in the number of independent retailers in New Zealand. And I think that's a genuine opportunity and a moment to sort of grasp the nettle and to move our narrative away from supermarkets. And to circle back round to your conversation around infrastructure, the reason that our infrastructure of the middle is being eroded is because we've put so much impact and focus on one piece of how we provision or where we find our food. And until we move away from that very narrow focus, we're going to have outcomes like the continual erosion of our manufacturing capacity.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from other panelists around infrastructure in particular?
I think the closure of the McCain's and the Watties factory is quite an interesting situation, because New Zealand actually exports more vegetables than we import, and what you've seen there is that if you look at frozen food, it really competes at a commodity level. So whether you buy it from China or from Europe or Australia, if you're buying a bag of peas, it's pretty much the same as a bag of peas from anywhere else. There might be issues around the production of it. And so I think one of the issues with those factories was actually export competitiveness. So it wasn't necessarily that, and this was part of it, that there were cheap imports coming into New Zealand, but the likes of Watties were struggling to compete internationally with it. And so I think one of the key messages from that is that actually a lot of that processing capacity that we have in New Zealand is actually based around export production. So we can't just think of it in terms of them competing with cheap imports. That manufacturing infrastructure was supported by their exports. So I think it's also important to realise we can't separate out the two markets in terms of our domestic market, our export markets, and also our import markets, that they're all part of the one system, and that the biggest problem that we have in New Zealand is lack of scale. I've travelled overseas. I love going into supermarkets. You go into a supermarket in the States and just think how many lettuces have to be produced and distributed every day to supermarkets across the state. Basically, if you walk into a Pack and Save at New World, it's a glorified farmers market. The very short supply chains, relatively low volume. So we just need to think about that and think about the biggest, one of the biggest problems in New Zealand is with our scale in food production, particularly as Scott would know. Once we move into what are more commodity products, then we just can't compete on the scale that Australia has. Even though, as their yields are minuscule compared to what we can produce, but it's scale that means that they can do it because they have fields of hundreds of hectares, whereas we're dealing with 30 or 40 hectares of wheat production.
Which is just, sorry to jump in again, which is another point to make, that a pea is not a pea is not a pea. And part of the reason that we had global markets for our frozen peas was the quality of those peas. New Zealand produces some of the highest quality nutrient-dense food in the world in some areas. So it's also super important that we acknowledge that there's an opportunity for New Zealand to connect the food that we produce and the health that it gives us. So I think if we stay in the space of just focusing on a commodity product and assuming that it's homogenous around the world, then we miss an opportunity. And I think there's a real opportunity. And I know that Foundation for Arable Research has done research in this space that talks about the quality of the food that we produce in this country.
Okay, thank you.
Grant, I'd probably just quickly add, look, I think there are hard infrastructure issues. They're well known. Great to see a national infrastructure plan being talked about and some bipartisan support, roading, transport, sea freight, all of that sort of stuff. But one point I would make that I think has been highlighted by the recent announcements by Watties and McCain's is sort of enabling functions or interdependencies that you don't necessarily understand until something happens. So if you take peas out of an arable system, what do you replace them with? What does that mean for the rotation? How do things shift around the countryside when there's that one sort of catalyst for change? And the other point I'd note that, and self-interest here from the arable sector, but if we saw arable decline over time, what does that mean for all of those enabling functionalities in terms of breeding wheat varieties for New Zealand conditions or breeding pasture varieties for New Zealand conditions from a seed production perspective? Because they're deeply connected functionalities to our export livestock sectors. And so there's a food element here, but there are deep connections between sectors as well that I think we don't always understand or always think about as fully as we might. And that's that is enabling infrastructure, but it's not roads or transport or shipping, but it is about skills that can be lost and have significant impact when they are lost.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of today's Frontline Forum. First of all, I'd really like to thank all our panelists, Scott, Nick, Angela, and Zara, for their very thoughtful contributions today on this important topic around food security and the wide-ranging discussion that we've had. Also, I'd like to thank those that have joined us online in particular, and for their commentary that has been pretty live in the chat function as well as in the Q&A as we've gone through this today. What's come through quite clearly is that food security is clearly not just about producing enough food, it's about how the system actually works and how it's pieced together, and from the farm gate to the plate, and includes things about the global markets as well as local access being really important. And there are real tensions in that, as we've discussed today. We also heard probably that this is not just that these pressures aren't just theoretical, they're probably real on food security, and it affects our households, our student life in the case of Zara, and in many parts of our food system. And that is, I guess, why conversations of this type really matter as to how we continue to have them. So thank you very much today for all those that have contributed and come along to this, the first Frontline Forum here as part of the State of Land series here at Link University. There will be a recording of this come available and very shortly. But thank you very much for joining us here today and the contributions that have come forth. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.